Welcome to Art is Essential, the Gavilan television show about the importance of art in our lives. I'm Fran Lozano, Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Gavilan College, and your host today. Each of our shows features a local artist or artist working in a different medium. Today we're on location at Cal State University Monterey Bay at the World Theater, where we have the privilege of speaking with Tobias Wolff, who is lecturing tonight as part of the President's Speaker Series. Welcome to the show, Tobias.
Nice to be here.
Well, we're just delighted to have you with us, and you've produced so many works. I'm going to list them. So we've got
I wish there were more to list.
This Boy's Life and In Pharaoh's Army, and then novels The Barracks Thief and Old School, and then collections of short stories In the Garden of North American Martyrs, Back in the World, The Night in Question, Our Story Begins. Did I miss anything?
I have another novel called The Barracks Thief,
okay.
Short novel. Other than that seems about right. 4 collections of stories.
That's wonderful, very prolific. So can you tell us?
Joyce Carol Oates is prolific. She's probably written a story just while we've been sitting here.
Okay. Well, how did Tobias Wolff, the writer, come into being? What was the process?
Well, I'll be talking about that at a little greater length tonight, but I was lucky enough to grow up in a time when we weren't perhaps quite so distracted as young people are now. I didn't have a television, for example, until our family got a television when I was, I think, 12 or 13. And my mother read a lot, and so I got in the habit of reading when I was young. And you know, it often seems to me when I hear people kind of blame teachers for the poor reading levels of their students, I wonder how often those students see their parents reading at home. We're very imitative when we're young, and it's one thing to actually see your parents read and see, oh, this is something that people do to get pleasure, and it's another thing to have your parents say, go read a book while they go watch The Wire, right? And you think, well, okay, that's just a duty, but the fun is in there, and with the widescreen TV, or, you know, obviously as we know, the technological distractions are tremendous now. But I grew up in a time really when reading was a principal kind of pleasure, and it isn't that my character was superior, or even that my upbringing was superior, or anything like that. It was just a kind of accident of time, and at a certain point I started writing imitations of the things that I read, just for fun. I'd write little stories for my mother to read when she came home from work, that kind of thing. And I guess the difference between me and a lot of kids my age at that time who probably did the same thing was that I just kept doing it.
And finding your voice is something that we talk about a lot, I guess, with writing. And how do you do that? And once you find that voice, how do you have the courage to write in your unique style when it's maybe not like everybody else's?
Mm-hmm. I think, to be honest with you, that maybe a little too much emphasis is put on this whole thing of finding your voice. It's kind of like telling people to find themselves, you know, when they're young. I think that what you want to do as a writer is forget about trying to create some individual voice, because what you'll probably end up doing is just creating something that sounds like somebody else. Where you'll discover your voice, as where you'll discover yourself, is in following your interests, writing about things that actually really interest you, and writing honestly, confronting your own character, being honest about revealing it, about your difficulties, about your challenges, about the things that come hard to you, and the things you love. And even as you do that, I think your language will begin to take on a kind of color of its own. Without your trying to make it, without your trying to find a color to paint over it, it'll arise naturally out of who you are, your interests, your fears, your history, all those things that go together to make a person up. I think will eventually enter the voice. I think it may be going about it the wrong way to continually be talking to people about finding their voice. I think it created a kind of falsity, actually, and a desperation. And so that's something, you know, as someone who encourages young writers, I would probably not insist on that much myself. Just as, you know, finding yourself, if you're constantly digging in yourself for yourself, I think you're just going to fall through a hole. I think what you have to do is look at the world around you and say, what out there interests me? What places do I really like to go? What kind of people do I actually like spending time with? Not that I'm kind of supposed to like spending time with, but actually like spending time. What I actually like doing, and not what I'm expected to do by a family or a community or a university, but what really gives me satisfaction. And that might be something very different from what we imagined ourselves doing to begin with, or who we imagined ourselves to be. I mean, we see this sort of thing, I think, all the time with people discovering their real identities in very painful ways because they've been trying so hard to live up to conventional models of who they're supposed to be, following a kind of track that others have laid down for them. And the human being doesn't like doing that. It'll jump the tracks eventually, and if it hasn't taken any care, if you haven't taken any care to kind of lay down your own, you're going to be kind of adrift for a while. So I think those two ideas are rather closely related, actually, this idea of finding your own voice and then figuring out who you are.
Okay, that's a great answer.
I hope it's true. Who knows? If I had the answer to everything, I'd be a lot richer than I am.
So, do you ever find that you have too much to write about? Is that ever a problem?
No, only in this way. If I'm writing a memoir, I've written two, and I've written occasional pieces that are not in the memoirs about memory. I had one recently out about an incident that happened when I was 15. The thing about memory is that once you start getting into it, every memory is connected, not just to one other memory, but 10 other memories, and those 10 are connected to 20 others, and it's sort of like that old thing that we used to do in Boy Scouts every year. We'd have a little kind of theatrical show, and we'd have a sheet, and there'd be some guy pretending to operate on somebody behind it, right? And with the shadows, you'd be pulling out tire chains and, you know, dead fish and, you know, out of this supposed operation. Memory's a little like that. It's so filled with things. So you have to really look for pattern in memory. Everything you remember is not in itself going to be valuable to something you're writing. So you have to be guided by some sense of how all these things begin to create a pattern, something that you can find some significance in. And you use that as a way of deciding really what's important to leave in and what's important maybe to leave out. Probably most of what you remember will get left on the cutting room floor, not because you're afraid of showing it or embarrassed by it, but because you've already done it, it's said all this in another way, or because it's so odd that it's so out of the kind of reach of your usual kind of character that it seems anomalous in some way. If it's importantly if it's importantly different, then you want to put it in. But you do have to exercise a lot of editorial ruthlessness, I think, in writing memoir. When I'm writing fiction, my fiction is sometimes drawn partly from memory. I think probably all fiction is. Our sense of the world that, you know, comes into our fiction comes from our lived life, and so inevitably memory is involved in that. But and I also find myself cutting a lot when I write fiction, but mostly at the level of language rather than event. So writing fiction is a little different in that way, and in some ways harder, in some ways easier.
Are you your only editor, or do you have other people who look at your work and give you suggestions?
Well, whatever I'm working on, story, essay, memoir, novel, I bring it to completion without showing it to anybody. That is, I bring it as far as I possibly can, and when it comes to the point where I can't see a way of making it better, then I show it to, first, my wife, who's a very good reader and honest with me. I mean, you have to find somebody who you can trust and who's honest. I mean, if I'd showed it to my mother, she always liked everything. So that was, I mean, it was nice, but it wasn't helpful in terms of actually getting a good kind of a shakedown run out of somebody else's reading. And there are a couple of other writers that I'll show my work to when it reaches that point also. And then if they have suggestions to make that seem to me in tune with what I wanted to do, with my ambition, not with what the story they would have written, but the story I wanted to write and maybe didn't quite get all of it down, but they see where the hole is, something like that. Then I'll take those things under advisement and take another run at the story. I already rewrite a lot even before it gets to the point of my giving anybody anything. And then I send it to my editor at the publishing house. He frequently has good suggestions to make. I take some of them, I don't take all of them, nor does he expect me to. And nor does any good editor expect you to take all their suggestions. But if I see something that's valuable to make the work that I want to write better, then I'll take it. I'm not one of these writers, and there are some writers like this who give you the manuscript and say, take it or leave it. This is it. And I sympathize with those writers. I mean, it's their name on it, and they're going to suffer the consequences for good or ill of that work, and they're going to take all the blame or they're going to take all the credit. And so, you know, I understand that impulse. But my attention is more on the work itself. I really want to get it right, make it as good as I possibly can. And if somebody says something to me that enables me to envision it in a better way, a different way that will make it better, then I'll take it.
Was Hemingway an influence in you?
Hemingway was probably the largest influence on me, in that it was probably more because of him than anyone else that I ever even wanted to be a writer. When I was younger, his style also, which is very infectious, influenced me tremendously, as you know, people always remark on the simplicity of the style. And to, you know, a young reader, it looks simple. In fact, of course, it's immensely complicated. His style, it's very poetic, it's very dark, has all kinds of undercurrents.
Well, in Kansas City, of course, we walked into trouble. Because we were reporters, we'd be there with our own eyes and our own ears seeing what was happening. Going back, writing it up, and there were 3 rules that I loved at the Kansas City Star. Number 1, use short sentences. Number 2, the first sentence should be short. Number 3, use the red pencil on all unnecessary adjectives. You never say he was seriously injured. All injuries are serious, but a wound is either dangerous or superficial. So an adjective is important then. And we learned this and kept writing the stories, but there was a war going on. This was 1917, and America had gotten into the war. I wanted to go there, but because of a boxing accident, I had only one working eye. I couldn't get into the Army. I tried again, they wouldn't let me in. Then I heard from the Red Cross. You could get into the Red Cross and drive an ambulance over there in the war. I got over there as fast as I could, and what I learned over there from the soldiers and from the medics and from the people in the hospitals, if people bring so much courage to this world, the world has to kill them to break them. The world kills everyone, and afterward many are strong at the broken places. But those that will not break, it kills.
It gives you somewhere to stand. You can imagine writing the sentences that Hemingway writes, even if actually you couldn't. Whereas when you read Faulkner, you can't imagine writing those sentences. You just, you know, it takes a really mature kind of reader, a very seasoned reader and writer to begin to take on the ambition of kind of Faulknerian style. Very few American writers do. Cormac McCarthy does. A guy named William Gay. A couple of others, but it's not in the kind of usual American vein, that style. The writer actually who learned most from Faulkner was Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who not only learned a lot from Faulkner's style, but also his kind of mythic sense of place, you know. And in 7 Years of Solitude, he's, you know, the place becomes like a character in there, and you have all these almost magical things going on in it. Snowfall the last 7 years, people getting assumed into heaven, things like that, which most of us don't witness, but he makes somehow believable, and part of it has to do with that extraordinary sensitivity to style that he has. He's a great writer.
Yeah. I'm thinking about Hemingway getting up early in the morning and standing at a podium and writing, and you have a process that's...
I wish I was as disciplined as Hemingway. I'm not. And I'm embarrassed to admit it, but Hemingway, in his 61 years, wrote a great, probably 3 times as much as I've written in my life, and I'm older than Hemingway now. So he was the most disciplined of writers, really, and not the most prolific. There are more prolific writers, but he wrote a lot of books, and they're all good. Some of them are great. The worst of them are just good. I mean, but good in a way that nobody else is. I mean, a book of his, for example, that often gets kind of made fun of is a novel of his that he wrote in the 50s called Across the River and Into the Trees. There's an element of self-parody almost in some of the style of that. But you know, if you had never heard of Ernest Hemingway and you read that novel, you'd be blown away by it. It's only that he raised the bar so high for reading him that people can make, you know, kind of disparaging comparisons, but the comparisons are always with his other work, not with anybody else. So, I mean, yeah, he was something else. He invented a kind of world. He invented a kind of code that a lot of, especially young men, I think, were very attentive to. People not just of my generation, but of the generations before and to some extent afterwards. So, you know, his style is pervasive not only in a literary way, but also in the kind of idea of manhood that he embodied and in his work to some extent, I suppose, promoted. I think unfortunately for him and for those who followed him, it's a pretty narrow band of being that if you get really, it can be pretty reductive, and he can seem a little reductive sometimes, but there's such a magnificent writer there, really. His arms are spread pretty wide.
And you teach others to write, and
I think that's overstating it. I'm not sure I teach others to write. I think what I do is, you can't just put that in somebody. What I do is help people to become better writers. And I mainly do that by helping them to become better editors of their own work. I mean, that's the big thing that I learned as a young writer. First of all, was patience, because you just want things to be perfect right away. And especially in our culture where we're used to getting things fast and the way we like them, we're not a patient people. And that is, of all things, the supreme virtue of the writer is patience. You really have to gnaw at the bone until it cracks and you get to the marrow. And so patience, and also a certain ruthlessness with your own work, which also does not come naturally to us. You have to be able to really look hard at what you've done and be willing to, as one writer put it, murder your darlings. That, you know, when you see things that you've lavished a lot of care and time on, And you look at it a couple of weeks later and it doesn't ring that bell, and in fact it kind of calls a lot of attention to itself in ways that don't help the work. It's got to come out, and that's hard to do, you know. So I can encourage people, I think, to become better editors of their own work. I can introduce them to other writers who, I mean, the work of other writers, not the writers themselves, whose work will help them learn better what they're doing. For example, if I were, say, young Cormac McCarthy were a student of mine, I would probably not be giving him Faulkner. I would probably give him Hemingway to learn how to, you know, write more efficiently and more exactly sometimes, and because he's still going to write like that other way anyway. But, you know, I'd kind of go against what you might think of as instinct. I would assign, I would ask young writers to read things that they might not naturally read, and that might challenge their own style a bit and their own way of thinking about writing, and enable them to make more decisions about writing. So in that way, it's really, it isn't something I can just put into somebody, but it's something I can probably help encourage and develop in another writer.
You've talked a little bit about technology, and I'd like to talk about texting and Facebook and even television.
Wrong man. I don't have a Facebook page. I don't text. I don't know anything about any of it. So I'm afraid I'm going to be useless on this subject.
Well, my question really is there still a place for the long written work in a society that uses so many shortcuts?
I don't know. I actually don't know. We'll find out, won't we?
Yeah, that's for sure.
And we won't find out because somebody tells us that. We'll find out because it'll either disappear or it'll stay.
Okay, we'll wait and see how the experiment works out.
We'll see. I hope so. I think something very precious will be lost if it goes, and I actually don't think it will. I think there'll always be somebody who's interested in it. But the question is how general an enthusiasm for you know, the long forms of writing will endure.
Well, I hear people of my generation talking about the loss of the physical book, and that a Kindle doesn't feel the same.
Yeah.
It's not the same experience.
I was going to say it's very generational. I don't even think that's true. If somebody gave me a Kindle, I read a manuscript for somebody, and just as a favor, but he wanted to do something for me, so he gave me a Kindle. It's about 5-6 years ago, one of the first ones. And I thought, he showed me how to use it and everything. I thought, oh goody, this is great. So I had recently read a novel of Dickens, and I wanted to reread a novel of his that I love a lot, Great Expectations. But I hadn't read it in about 20 years. So I downloaded Great Expectations onto the Kindle, $1.95, good deal. And I started reading it. I read about 2 or 3 pages. I thought, guys, this is really good. I'm going to get the book. So, you know, I went and got the book and read the book with great joy. But the idea of actually continuing to do this thing, and I kept hitting the wrong button, and the page would go back the wrong way, and I just wasn't at home with it. But my brother, who's older than I am, he's 8 years older than I am, only reads on Kindle. He's a complete addict of that technology. His eyes aren't great. He can enlarge the font to his wishes. He's always been much more fluent with technology than I have. When we would visit his house, and my wife and kids and I would always laugh at all the remotes he would have around, and always the biggest TV you could possibly have, and all this kind of thing. And all kinds of machines to feed the TV, and he was the first person first writer of my acquaintance to start writing on a computer. And so it isn't just generational, it's a different personality or something, and I'm just kind of maybe I'm a little lazy that way, I don't know. I was slow to get to the typewriter. I've never learned to type. When I do write on a computer myself now, but I hunt and peck, and for years I wrote in longhand long after friends of mine had gone over to typewriters, and I learned to write on a typewriter, and I thought I'd never do anything else, and it took me a long time to change the computer. So I'm really the wrong guy to be asking about trends.
Okay, then I'll ask you another question. We always ask at the end of our show, why is art essential to you? Why is your writing essential to who you are as a person?
Well, that's a very, very good question. I'm sure everyone would answer it differently. In my case, my parents split up when I was a kid. My brother went with my father. I grew up with my mother. She worked for a living always, and I was alone a lot. And yet, in the particular art that I was drawn to, that is of the written word, I found always reliable and interesting companionship. And not just a sense of escape, though that was certainly part of the joy of it, but the experience of meeting through that medium the spirit of other people whose spirits were similarly troubled or beset, gives you a sense of reassurance and sometimes even consolation. To know that you have company in the world, that other people feel what you do, are troubled as you are searching and not finding, and continuing to search and to hope. It was just something that entered my life as a kind of reliable company when I was young, and I'm grateful to say, never deserted me.
Well, thank you very much. That's just lovely.
Well, thank you.
And thank you so much for being with us today. As I say, it's a wonderful honor to be able to speak with you and to hear what you have to say about the writing process.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Join us next time on Art is Essential, when we'll speak with another artist.